At this time, I would like to welcome everyone to the in-depth presentation webinar on the Water Quality Standard Variance Requirements in the Water Quality Standards Regulatory Revisions Final Rule. My name is Janita Aguirre from the EPA Office of Water, Office of Science and Technology, located in EPA headquarters in Washington, D.C. Gary Russo of my office will lead today's presentation, and Gary, Sherry Barish, and Manjali Volkan will help address your clarifying questions today. All lines have been placed on mute to prevent any background noise during today's webinar. Before we proceed, let me go over some logistical information. We are using the EPA's Adobe Connect service for today's webinar. You should be able to see the presentation on your screen now. You have two options for hearing today's presentation. If you have computer speakers or headphones, you should be able to hear the presentation through your computer system. If you do not have speakers or headphones, you can connect to the audio portion of this presentation by dialing 1-866-299-3188. Once prompted, enter in the code 202-566-1149 and then hit the pound key. You only need to use one of these options to access the audio portion of today's call. If you use both computer speakers and dial into the phone line, you will hear feedback. If you experience any technical difficulties during this webinar, you may click the Help button at the top of your screen. Or you may contact us for assistance by typing your issue in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. This webinar is part of a series of webinars EPA intends to hold to inform the public about the revised Part 131 Water Quality Standards Regulation. It is being recorded, and EPA intends to post it on our rulemaking website for future viewing. During the webinar series, EPA will provide an informational presentation, followed 2 days later by a question and answer session, where EPA will respond to your submitted questions. While each presentation webinar may allow time to address a few clarifying questions, we encourage you to submit your questions in the chat box or submit them to WQS Regulatory Clarifications at EPA.gov, and EPA can address them at the question and answer session webinars. While EPA intends to address as many questions as possible, please be aware that EPA may not have time to address all questions submitted. So the sooner you submit the question following the presentation webinar, the more likely EPA will be able to address it at the question and answer session. If we are unable to address your question during the question and answer session, please know that we will use the question to inform any future guidance we provide. EPA expects that those who have tuned in have read the final rule and want to delve more into the final Water Quality Standard Variance requirements. Therefore, the main purpose of today's webinar is to provide you with an in-depth information about the Water Quality Standard Variance requirements that were published on August 21st, 2015, and to allow you an opportunity to ask clarifying questions. Because today's webinar is informational and EPA is describing the contents of the final Water Quality Standard Regulation, it is important that we are clear that today's webinar does not itself impose any binding requirements, determine any obligations of the regulated community, change or substitute for any statutory provision or regulatory requirement, or represent, change, or substitute for agency policy or guidance. Further, today's discussion does not control any case of conflict between this discussion and the statute, regulation, EPA policy, or guidance. Let's turn now to the presentation on the Water Quality Standard Variance requirements in the final rule. Again, you may submit your questions in the chat box, and we will respond to a few today and address additional questions during the question and answer session in a couple of days. I'll turn it over to Gary to lead us through the presentation.
Thank you, Janita. The first thing I'm going to do is provide a short summary of the new variance regulation. Then I will explain how EPA intends for states and tribes to utilize some of the flexibilities in the regulation to implement variances. After that, I will address a few key questions EPA has become aware of during the regulation revision process. You can submit your clarifying questions at any time using the comment box on the right of your screen, and I will periodically pause to respond to as many clarifying questions as time allows. In this webinar, when I say tribes, I mean federally recognized Indian tribes authorized to implement and manage their water quality standards program. Over the years, the EPA has encouraged states and tribes to utilize water quality standards variances as a way to make incremental progress towards attaining designated uses that are not immediately attainable. A variance can provide a regulatory mechanism to allow actions that improve water quality when a designated use is not attainable in the present, but the state or tribe wants to retain the designated use as a future goal. In the past, the water quality standards regulations said little about water quality standards variances other than states and tribes may adopt policies generally affecting their application and implementation. This led to uncertainty and confusion about how, when, and where to use variances that has contributed to public skepticism about the use of variances as a tool to improve water quality. The Water Quality Standards Regulation now contains an entirely new section at 131.14 dedicated specifically to water quality standards variances. This section of the regulation explicitly authorizes variances and includes requirements that will ensure the public has the opportunity for input on when, where, and how variances are used while providing regulatory certainty to states and tribes and the regulated community. Before we move to the next slide, I want to clarify the difference between these federal regulations on variances, a variance itself, and a state variance policy. To be clear, states and tribes do not need a variance authorizing provision in their water quality standards to utilize variances. The federal regulation at 131.14 provides such authorization. However, where a state or tribe chooses to adopt or has already adopted a binding variance policy and or procedure in their water quality standards, such a policy and or procedure must be consistent with 131.14 if they are to result in the adoption of a variance for Clean Water Act purposes. If a state or tribe has a variance policy and or procedure that is inconsistent with 131.14, EPA recommends they revise them prior to or simultaneously with adopting the first variance so that their water quality standards variances are consistent with the federal regulation. 131.14 addresses four primary subjects related to water quality standards variances. The first subject defines what a variance is and when, where, and how they may be used. The second subject establishes specific requirements for the variance itself. The third subject establishes the information a state or tribe will need to submit to EPA when requesting review and approval of a variance. And the fourth subject provides a specific regulatory link between a water quality standards variance and the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES, permits. It is important to note that the term variance is also used elsewhere in the Clean Water Act and implementing regulation. For example, the Clean Water Act mentions variances in the context of modifying secondary treatment requirements for publicly owned treatment works that discharge into marine waters, 301H, and modifications to effluent guidelines when a facility is fundamentally different than those considered when establishing the guidelines. Those types of variances are strictly related to certain NPDES permit requirements and are not addressing them here. What we are addressing here is 131.14 for variances to water quality standards. First, the regulation explicitly defines a water quality standards variance as a time-limited designated use and criterion for specific pollutants or water quality parameters that reflect the highest attainable condition during the term of the variance. We didn't include a definition of highest attainable condition in the definition section of the rule because it has a plain meaning. It is the condition of the water body or effluent that is achievable and is closest to the underlying designated use and criteria. The rule provides several ways to express the highest attainable condition for a variance. The regulation specifies that a variance only applies to NPDES permit limits and requirements under Section 402 of the Act. A variance could also be used when issuing certifications under Section 401 of the Act. This means that a variance cannot apply to listing waters as impaired or for calculating the load and waste load allocations of a TMDL under Section 303D of the Act. Because the goal of a variance is to make progress toward attaining a designated use that is not currently attainable, it is important to ensure that the protection provided by all other criteria related to the underlying designated use are maintained and that the underlying goal remains in place. The regulation prohibits using a variance if the designated use can be achieved by implementing technology-based effluent limits required under Sections 301B and 306 of the Act. This means that a water quality standards variance cannot be used to exempt a discharger from technology-based limits. The regulation also prohibits a variance from lowering currently attained water quality. The purpose of this provision is to ensure that a variance does not make water quality worse while not imposing a hurdle to incremental progress. EPA chose not to include the same prohibition on removal of an existing use as found in 131.10H1 regarding designated uses, so that a variance could be used as a tool to restore existing uses that have been degraded. There is one single exception to the prohibition of lowering currently attained water quality. That exception is when the variance is used for the purpose of facilitating lake, wetland, or stream restoration through dam removal or other significant reconfiguration activities. This restoration and reconfiguration factor is an additional factor that can be used to justify a variance in addition to the existing 6 factors that I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. We chose to allow an exception to the prohibition of lowering currently attained water quality for this new factor, since the purpose of such a variance is to allow the temporary flush of, for example, sediments when a dam is removed. Finally, the regulation clarifies that a variance is itself a water quality standard subject to EPA review and approval or disapproval. A variance cannot be used for any Clean Water Act purposes, including using it as the basis for NPDES permit limits, until it has been reviewed and approved by EPA. The regulation requires a water quality standards variance to include certain types of information. This information must be in the variance itself, which the state or tribe adopts as legally binding pursuant to state or tribal law. The variance must identify where and to whom the variance applies. This includes the permittees if a discharger specific variance, or the water bodies or water body segments if a water body variance. If the variance applies to one or more permittees, the variance must also identify the location of the waters receiving the discharge. The variance must identify the specific pollutants or pollutant parameters that will be the subject of the variance, and the interim requirements that apply during the variance term. The regulation requires the interim requirements to reflect the highest attainable condition of the water body or effluent. As I briefly mentioned before, the phrase highest attainable condition means the condition of the water body or effluent that is achievable and is closest to the underlying designated use and criteria. The regulation requires the highest attainable condition to be expressed in a quantifiable manner. Let me pause to explain what EPA means by quantifiable. In the context of a variance, quantifiable means in a manner that is measurable and accessible. The purpose of requiring a quantifiable expression of the highest attainable condition is to ensure that a variance results in measurable progress toward the underlying designated use. For most discharger-specific and pollutant-specific variances, EPA believes that expressing the highest attainable condition in a quantifiable manner will not be difficult because such variances usually express the highest attainable condition as the concentration of a pollutant in a permittee's effluent. However, EPA does recognize there may be some situations where specifying a concentration may not adequately characterize the highest attainable condition. The regulation provides states and tribes with the flexibility to express the highest attainable condition as any quantitative expression that describes the anticipated pollutant reduction. For example, a state or tribe could express the highest attainable condition associated with combined sewer overflows as a maximum number of overflows, a percentage of time attaining the underlying designated use, or a hydrologic measurement such as flow or rainfall amounts, beyond which suspends a water quality standard. A quantifiable expression of the highest attainable condition is an important feature of a variance because it provides clear expectations of water quality progress, helps the permitting authority develop permit limits and requirements, and allows states, tribes, and the public to track progress toward the goal of attaining the underlying designated use. For discharge-specific variances, the regulation requires expression of the highest attainable condition in one of three ways: a criterion representing the highest attainable water quality, an effluent condition representing the greatest pollutant reduction achievable, or, if additional pollutant controls are not feasible, the effluent quality obtained with the greatest pollutant reduction achievable using the current controls in place and adoption and implementation of a pollutant minimization program if feasible pollutant controls cannot be identified. The requirements for a variance to a water body or water body segment are slightly different, as I'll explain shortly. Finally, the variance must specify its term, that is, the period of time during which the variance applies. The regulation provides states and tribes with the flexibility to express the variance term as either a specific date or as an interval of time after EPA approval. An important change between the proposed and final regulation is that the proposed regulation specified a maximum water quality standards variance term of 10 years, whereas the final regulation does not specify a maximum term. EPA removed the maximum variance term to eliminate the burden and cost associated with renewing a variance when a state or tribe can justify a longer term. However, to ensure that the goal of the variance reflects the highest attainable condition throughout the variance term, the regulation includes additional requirements for variances that last longer than 5 years. First, if a state or tribe adopts a variance longer than 5 years, the variance must specify a reevaluation frequency at least every 5 years, and how the state or tribe will obtain public input on the reevaluations. The regulation also requires the results of the reevaluations to be submitted to EPA within 30 days. The regulation provides the flexibility to specify the frequency of reevaluation to coincide with other state and tribal processes such as triennial reviews or permit renewals, as long as they occur at least every 5 years. EPA does not review and approve or disapprove the results of the reevaluations. The purpose of a reevaluation is to ensure the state or tribe is evaluating the progress that has been achieved so far to determine whether the state or tribe is on track to achieving the highest attainable condition or whether something better can be achieved, and to allow the public an opportunity to provide input on the progress and highest attainable condition at predictable and regular intervals during the variance term. Another requirement when adopting a variance longer than 5 years is that the state or tribe must include in the variance a provision that specifies the applicable interim requirements of the variance as either the highest attainable condition initially adopted or the highest attainable condition later identified during any reevaluation, whichever is more stringent. This provision must be written in a way that ensures any more stringent highest attainable condition later identified automatically becomes the applicable highest attainable condition of the variance without requiring any additional action. Upon permit reissuance, this provision allows the permitting authority to establish a more stringent water quality-based effluent limit and or other permit conditions on the basis of the more stringent highest attainable condition consistent and without the need for an additional water quality standards rulemaking. Finally, a state or tribe adopting a variance longer than 5 years must include a provision in the variance specifying that the variance will no longer be applicable for Clean Water Act purposes if any required reevaluation is not conducted consistent with the provision in the variance, or the results of any reevaluation is not submitted to EPA within 30 days. The statement must be written in a manner that ensures that if either of these situations occur, the underlying designated use and criterion, rather than the variance requirements, will become the applicable water quality standard without any additional action by the state, tribe, or EPA. In a few minutes, I will discuss in more detail how EPA anticipates variance reevaluations will work and the flexibilities in the regulation that allow states and tribes to reevaluate a variance with a minimum of administrative burden. In addition to the information the regulation requires in the Water Quality Standards variance itself, the regulation also specifies certain supporting documentation to be submitted to EPA when requesting review and approval of the variance. However, the required documentation depends on the designated use the variance addresses. The webinar scheduled for October 20 is going to cover designated uses in detail, so I'm not going to say much about that here. But I do need to take a moment to briefly explain an important distinction between two categories of uses in the Clean Water Act that the regulation now clearly articulates. The Clean Water Act distinguishes between two broad categories of uses: uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act, and uses specified in Section 303C2 of the Act. Uses specified in Section 101A2 of the Act are those uses that provide for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, and wildlife, and recreation in and on the water, and for the protection of human health when consuming fish, shellfish, and other aquatic life. Uses not specified in Section 101A2, but listed in Section 303C2 include uses such as public water supply, agricultural, industrial, and navigation. EPA calls these uses non-101A2 uses. The distinction between these two categories of uses is important for variances because the general framework for adopting a variance is analogous to removing a designated use. The regulation now specifies that a state or tribe may remove a 101A2 use and criteria only after demonstrating that the use and criteria are not attainable due to at least one of the 6 factors specified in 13110G and must adopt the highest attainable use in its place. Similarly, a state or tribe may adopt a variance that addresses a 101A2 use and criteria only after demonstrating the use and criteria are not attainable during the term of the variance due to at least one of the 6 factors specified in 13110G, as well as an additional factor only for variances that allow a temporary lowering of water quality to remove a dam or perform a significant wetland, lake, or stream restoration activity. Additionally, the regulation now specifies that a state or tribe may remove a non-101A2 use and criteria after demonstrating consideration of the use and value of the water for that use. Similarly, a state or tribe may adopt a variance that addresses a non-101A2 use by demonstrating how consideration of the use and value supports adoption of the variance with the specified term. This is a good place to take a moment to explain why the regulatory framework for adopting a variance is similar to removing a designated use. EPA received public comments on the proposed regulation questioning why EPA doesn't just define a variance as a temporary change to a criterion or permit limit and leave designated uses alone. The reason is because the Water Quality Standards Regulation requires states to establish designated uses for their waters and to adopt water quality criteria to protect designated uses. The permitting regulations also require permits to derive from and comply with water quality standards. Although dischargers often desire a variance because they have difficulty complying with the permit limit for a particular pollutant, simply providing a less stringent permit limit for that pollutant without also revising the water quality standard would mean that the permit would no longer derive from and comply with water quality standards. And if the state or tribe simply adopts a less stringent criterion for that one pollutant without also changing the designated use, that would mean the criterion no longer protects the designated use. EPA cannot dissociate the concepts of permit limits that derive from criteria and criteria that protect designated uses. Therefore, an important legal construct for variances is that they provide for a revised, although time-limited, designated use that is protected by a revised, usually less stringent criterion that becomes the basis for a less stringent permit limit. Even though the new variance regulation allows the highest attainable condition to be expressed as a less stringent criterion or effluent limit, such expressions are considered other ways of expressing a less stringent designated use. I mentioned before that the regulation requires the variance itself to include the term, which must only be as long as necessary to achieve the highest attainable condition. The regulation also requires the state or tribe to submit documentation justifying the term of the variance when submitting the variance to EPA for review and approval. The information justifying the variance term should include the information and factors that were evaluated to justify adopting the variance in the first place, as well as the pollutant control activities the state or tribe anticipates will be implemented during the variance term to achieve the highest attainable condition. This information will be used by EPA to evaluate variances submitted for review and approval, serve to inform the permitting authority when developing the enforceable terms and conditions of the permit, and as milestones that can be used to track water quality progress. The new variance regulation at 131.14 reinforces the permit regulation at 122.44 D1 VII-A by specifying that any limitations and requirements of the water quality standards variance must be included as enforceable conditions of the NPDES permit. A variance may include additional requirements that do not factor into QBEL calculations, water quality-based effluent limit calculations. For example, I mentioned before that in situations where additional pollutant control technologies are not feasible to implement, the regulation allows expression of the highest attainable condition as an effluent quality after optimizing the pollutant control technologies already in place and adopting and implementing a pollutant minimization program. For such a variance, the requirements of the pollutant minimization program are part of the highest attainable condition of the variance and therefore must be included as requirements in the permit. The permitting authority would likely include such requirements in the special conditions section of a permit.
Okay. Let's stop now to take a couple of clarifying questions. I see that we have one question in our queue, and if you have any additional questions, please enter them into the chat box now. As a reminder, we will address many more of your clarifying questions on Wednesday's question and answer session webinar. Please email any additional questions after this presentation to the email address on the slide, WQS Regulatory Clarifications @epa.gov. So the first question that we have in the chat box is, can a variance be considered for a naturally occurring human health carcinogen such as arsenic?
This is Manjali, and I'll answer that question. It's a good question. The regulations do not have any restrictions on the type of pollutants that a variance can be adopted for. However, it is important to know that water quality standards variances are not permanent solutions. The purpose of a water quality standards variance is to make incremental progress towards the underlying designated use or until the state revises their designated uses. So it's important to keep that in mind. Usually in these instances, it's probably best for states to work with their EPA regional offices to determine the best way to approach a variance for such a pollutant.
Okay, thank you. We have a second question. Does the use of site-specific studies, such as recalculation or the water effect ratio, now require a variance? I'm going to ask Sherry to address this question.
Hi, that's also a very good question. So just to describe the difference between site-specific criteria changes and a change that will occur in a variance that really impacts the answer to this question is that for site-specific criteria, you are changing the criteria but still protecting the same designated use. In a variance, similar to a use change, you are protecting a different, in this case the varied, designated use. Although in a variance you're also
altering the criteria for the purpose of NPDES permitting and for issuing 401 certifications. So to answer the question, no, variances are not needed for recalculation or water effect ratio studies. People should be doing those in the way that they have done those in the past. They work with your state and or your EPA region to perform those studies and ultimately submit a change to standards that's a different site-specific criteria, or where someone is using a performance-based method for developing that criteria and following their performance-based method, they can implement their site-specific criteria after those studies. Okay, thank you, Sherry. And I did see in the chat box that there was some problem hearing the first response, so I'm going to ask Manjali to speak into a different speaker and address the question again. Can a variance be considered for a naturally occurring human health carcinogen such as arsenic?
Again, I apologize. Apparently our speakers are not working equally. So the answer to that question is yes, a variance can be considered for a naturally occurring human health carcinogen. Our regulations don't restrict variances to any particular pollutants or prohibit variances for any particular pollutants. However, it is important to know that water quality standards variances are not permanent solutions to naturally occurring pollutant problems. The purpose of a water quality standards variance is to provide time to make incremental progress until that underlying designated use is met or until the state revises the designated use to adopt a different highest attainable use. Often in these situations, it can be best for states and authorized tribes to work with their EPA regional office to determine the best way to approach pollutant challenges related to human naturally occurring pollutants.
Okay. And I do see that we have additional questions in the chat box. We're going to keep going through the presentation, and we will have another question break in a few minutes. So, Gary, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. I briefly mentioned before that dischargers often desire a water quality standards variance because they're having difficulty complying with a water quality-based effluent limit for a particular pollutant. However, there may be situations where attaining the criterion for a specific pollutant is not feasible for a limited period of time in an entire water body or water body segment. In such a situation, a variance may be adopted for the entire water body or water body segment. From here on, I'll refer to a variance for a water body or water body segment as a water body variance. A water body variance is similar to a discharger-specific variance, except the variance applies to the entire water body or water body segment rather than just at the point where a specific discharger or dischargers is discharging. The purpose of a water body variance is to provide an opportunity for a state or tribe to work with both point and non-point sources on a water body or watershed scale to achieve pollutant reductions and make progress toward attaining the designated use. Okay, I'll move it over to another microphone. To reflect the larger scope of a water body variance, the regulation includes several requirements to ensure public transparency and accountability. First, the regulation does not allow the flexibility to express the highest attainable condition as an effluent condition because EPA expects a water body variance to involve feasible pollutant reductions that may vary among dischargers. Instead, the regulation requires identification of an interim designated use when expressing the highest attainable condition because a water body variance impacts the entire water body in a manner similar to a change in the designated use, and assessment of the highest attainable condition for this type of variance necessarily involves an evaluation of all pollutant sources. Second, the regulation requires identification and documentation of any cost-effective and reasonable best management practices for non-point source controls related to the pollutants or water quality parameters that could be implemented to make progress toward attaining the underlying designated use. I emphasize the word could because the regulation does not require implementation of best management practices for non-point source controls. The regulation does require identification and documentation of non-point source controls because the purpose of a water body variance is to make progress towards attaining the underlying designated use and such progress will likely require the cooperation of both point and non-point sources. Knowing this information will help facilitate potential actions that could result in achieving water quality progress. In addition, requiring states and authorized tribes to provide the public with information about the potential impact of controlling non-point sources of pollutants increases public transparency and accountability. For the same reasons, any subsequent water body variance must include documentation of whether and to what extent any best management practices were implemented and the water quality progress that was achieved. Now that I've summarized the regulatory requirements for water quality standards variances, I'm going to spend the rest of the webinar explaining a few important points that we think will help give you a better understanding of how EPA anticipates variances will work. When developing the variance regulations, EPA tried to achieve two objectives that on the surface might appear contradictory. One objective was to establish regulatory requirements to ensure there is sufficient public transparency and public input when utilizing variances. The other objective was to minimize administrative burden that might discourage the use of variances to make water quality progress. To accomplish both objectives, EPA removed the 10-year maximum variance term that was initially proposed and replaced it with several requirements that ensure the public has the ability to understand and provide input on how variances are utilized. First, the regulation specifies that the term of any variance can only be as long as necessary to achieve the highest attainable condition. The regulation requires a state or tribe to submit documentation that justifies the variance term when submitting the variance to EPA for review and approval. A state or tribe must establish the variance term that represents only the time needed to achieve the highest attainable condition by the end of the variance term. The regulation explicitly allows a state or tribe to adopt a subsequent variance after a variance expires as long as the subsequent variance complies with the requirements of 131.14. EPA is not calling a subsequent variance a renewal because the word renewal implies an ongoing condition that does not change. The purpose of a water quality standards variance is to make progress towards the underlying designated use, and EPA's expectation is that a variance results in progressively better water quality over time. Finally, the regulation requires variances longer than 5 years to be reevaluated at least every 5 years. EPA chose 5 years as the maximum interval between reevaluations because 5 years is the length of a single permit cycle, which allows the reevaluation to inform the permit reissuance process. I previously mentioned that EPA chose 5 years as the maximum reevaluation interval because 5 years is the length of a single permit cycle and will allow reevaluations to inform the permit reissuance process. However, the regulation allows reevaluations to occur more frequently than 5 years if, for example, a state or tribe wants to coordinate their variance reevaluations with their triennial review process. States and tribes have the discretion to establish a reevaluation schedule in association with permit reissuances, triennial reviews, or any other schedule they choose, provided they occur no less frequently than every 5 years. Now, I'm going to describe how a state or tribe can use this flexibility to reevaluate a variance in different ways to minimize administrative burden. This isn't not to say that EPA believes variance reevaluations are going to be complicated or time-consuming. Since the final rule was published, EPA has received questions about how the reevaluation process is supposed to work. We hope that by explaining it here, we will alleviate some of the confusion about what a state and tribe must do to comply with the variance reevaluation requirements in the regulation. This slide shows how water quality standards variance reevaluations could work if a state or a tribe chooses to establish a 5-year reevaluation schedule synchronized to permit reissuance. It might seem complicated at first, so I will explain the next 2 slides and then we'll pause to address some clarifying questions. This illustration represents a hypothetical scenario where a state or a tribe adopts and EPA approves a water quality standards variance with a 20-year term and a reevaluation frequency of 5 years. To make this hypothetical scenario simple, let's assume the variance applies to a single discharger for a single pollutant and starts at the beginning of the discharger's permit cycle. Time moves from left to right. The term of the variance is shown as the length of the rectangle labeled Variance 1. Below that are blocks with sequential numbers that each represent 1 year. Below that are rectangles that represent sequential permit terms. Notice that the width of the rectangles representing the permit terms are the same, representing the 5-year permit term, but also notice the height of the rectangles change as time passes from left to right. The height of the permit rectangles indicates the water quality-based effluent limit for the permit term. The shorter the height, the more stringent the water quality-based effluent limit. Now let's start at the beginning on the left and move through time to the right. In this hypothetical scenario, the state or tribe has determined that the underlying designated use is not currently attainable, but progress can be made towards the designated use. The state or tribe's analysis identifies the highest attainable condition as a specific concentration of the pollutant in the discharger's effluent and estimates it will become feasible to achieve this concentration within 20 years. The state or tribe adopts a water quality standards variance that meets the requirements of 131.14 with a 20-year term, a highest attainable condition specified as the highest attainable effluent concentration within 20 years, and a reevaluation frequency of 5 years. At the far left, the first thing that happens is the state or tribe adopts and EPA approves the water quality standards variance. The permitting authority then identifies the highest attainable condition in the variance and establishes the water quality-based effluent limit for that pollutant as the effluent concentration specified in the variance. The water quality-based effluent limit is represented as the height of the gray rectangle labeled Permit 1. In years 1 through 4 of the first permit cycle, the state or tribe conducts a triennial review. Because a variance is itself a water quality standard, it must also be reviewed on a triennial basis. EPA expects states and tribes to include variances in their normal triennial review process, just like any other water quality standard. In this example, the triennial review process did not provide any new data or information about the highest attainable condition specified in the variance. At year 5, when the permit is due to expire, the state or tribe conducts a reevaluation because the variance specifies a reevaluation frequency of 5 years. During each variance reevaluation, EPA expects the state or tribe to actively search for and solicit from the public new or updated data and information that could indicate a more stringent, highest attainable condition exists than the state or tribe originally adopted. New or updated data and information includes such things as pollutant control technologies, changes in pollutant sources, flow or water levels, economic considerations, and pollutant minimization program practices that can impact the highest attainable condition. This information must be evaluated in the context of the highest attainable conditions specified in the variance and the duration of the variance term. Also, the state or tribe must obtain public input into the reevaluation and must submit the results to EPA within 30 days. To be clear, reevaluations are not subject to an approval-disapproval action by EPA. However, if the state or tribe does not conduct a reevaluation or does not submit the results to EPA within 30 days, the provision in the variance that specifies the variance will no longer be the applicable standard in such a situation will take effect without requiring EPA or the state or tribe to take an additional water quality standards action. This will result in the underlying designated use and criterion becoming the applicable standard for the upcoming permit reissuance. Because any water quality standards variance longer than 5 years must also contain a provision that specifies the requirements of the Water Quality Standards variance are either the highest attainable condition identified at the time of adoption or the highest attainable condition later identified during any reevaluation, the permitting authority must refer to the reevaluation results when reissuing the permit to ensure the permit derives from and complies with water quality standards. In this hypothetical scenario, the state or tribe does not find any new data or information indicating a more stringent highest attainable condition during the first reevaluation. Noting the reevaluation results did not identify a more stringent highest attainable condition, the permitting authority reissues the permit with the same water quality-based effluent limit as the previous permit. In years 6 through 9, during the second permit cycle, labeled Permit 2, the state or tribe conducts 2 triennial reviews and again does not find any new data or information related to the highest attainable conditions specified in the variance. At year 10, the permit will expire and the discharger begins working on renewing the permit. Again, the state or tribe reevaluates the variance consistent with its 5-year evaluation schedule, but this time determines that greater pollution reduction is feasible by the permittee than initially thought when the variance was adopted. Because the variance contains a provision saying that the applicable highest attainable condition is the highest attainable condition initially adopted or any more stringent highest attainable condition later identified during a reevaluation, the more stringent highest attainable condition automatically becomes the applicable highest attainable condition of the variance, eliminating the need to perform another water quality standards rulemaking to incorporate the new, more stringent highest attainable condition in the variance. The permitting authority recognizes the newly identified more stringent highest attainable condition as the applicable water quality standard and uses it as the basis for a more stringent permit limit. This more stringent permit limit is illustrated as the gray rectangle labeled Permit 3 that is slightly shorter than the rectangle labeled Permit 2. In years 11 through 14, during the third permit cycle, the state or tribe performs a triennial review. Unlike the previous 3 triennial reviews, however, in this hypothetical example, the triennial review reveals new data or information suggesting greater pollutant reduction may be feasible by the permittee. However, also notice that the permit limit during the third permit cycle does not change. Clean Water Act Section 402K and Section 122.5A of the permitting regulation specifies that the permit requirements cannot be changed until a permit reissuance unless the permit contains a reopener clause. In this case, there is no reopener clause in the permit, so the permit continues to provide the same permit limits until the upcoming reissuance. At year 15, the permit will soon expire and the discharger begins working on renewing the permit. The state or tribe again performs the scheduled variance reevaluation by searching for new or updated data and information. The state or tribe identifies the data and information revealed during the triennial review that suggested greater pollutant reduction may be feasible by the permittee. This information, along with additional information obtained during the course of the reevaluation, indicates a more stringent highest attainable condition is feasible. Again, the permitting authority incorporates the newly identified more stringent highest attainable condition into the permit as the basis for a more stringent permit limit, illustrated as the gray rectangle labeled Permit 4 that is slightly shorter than the rectangle labeled Permit 3. At year 20, the variance is due to expire, and the state or tribe assesses all the conditions that justify the variance. In this scenario, the state or tribe's analysis concludes that the underlying designated use is still not attainable, but believes reasonable progress is still possible. The state or tribe identifies the highest attainable condition for an 8-year term and adopts a subsequent variance. In this example, the state or tribe's analysis determines the highest attainable condition to be slightly more stringent. The permitting authority establishes the permit limits on the basis of the new water quality standards variance, illustrated as the gray rectangle labeled Permit 5 that is slightly shorter than Permit 4. This slide shows how water quality standards variance reevaluations or how reevaluations could work if a state chooses to establish a 3-year reevaluation schedule synchronized to their triennial review schedule. The scenario is the same as the scenario illustrated in the previous slide, except that the variance reevaluations occur during each triennial review rather than permit reissuance. During the first permit cycle of Variance 1, the state or tribe reevaluates the water quality standards variance at the same time it performs its triennial review and finds no new data or information suggesting the permittee is capable of attaining a more stringent highest attainable condition. As I mentioned before, EPA expects all states and tribes to review water quality standards variances in their triennial review process, just like any other water quality standard. However, EPA recognizes that different states and tribes have different ways of conducting their triennial reviews. For example, some states and tribes group their waters and rotate through each group with sequential triennial reviews. To be clear, if a state or tribe chooses to specify a reevaluation frequency of 3 years in order to synchronize them to their triennial review process, EPA expects a complete and thorough reevaluation, as I described in the previous slide, during every triennial review. Again, variance reevaluations are not subject to an approval-disapproval action by EPA, but if the state or tribe does not perform the reevaluation according to the schedule that they have set out or submit the results to EPA within 30 days, the underlying designated use and criterion becomes the applicable water quality standard for the permittee without EPA or the state or tribe taking any additional action. At year 5, when Permit 1 expires and the permit is being renewed, the permitting authority must refer to any reevaluation that occurred after the permit was last issued to determine if a more stringent highest attainable condition was identified. In this hypothetical example, the reevaluation the state or tribe conducted at the same time of the last triennial review did not find new data or information indicating a more stringent highest attainable condition. The permitting authority reissues the permit, here labeled Permit 2, with the same permit limit as Permit 1. During the permit cycle labeled Permit 2, the state or tribe reevaluates the variance at each triennial review. In this example, the variance reevaluation that occurred during the triennial review between years 9 and 10 resulted in data and information indicating a more stringent highest attainable condition is feasible. The permit limit does not immediately change because, as I mentioned before, permit requirements cannot be changed until permit reissuance unless the permit contains a reopener clause. In this case, there is no reopener clause in the permit, so the permit continues to provide the same permit limits. At year 10, when Permit 2 is expiring and the permitting authority is reissuing the permit, the permitting authority refers to the variance reevaluations that occurred since the permit was last issued, and the permitting authority identifies the reevaluation that occurred during the triennial review between year 9 and 10 as identifying a more stringent higher attainable condition, or highest attainable condition. The permitting authority establishes a permit limit for Permit 3 on the basis of the more stringent highest attainable condition. The same process occurs for the terms of Permit 3 and 4. The variance is reevaluated during each triennial review. When the permit is being reissued, the permitting authority refers to the variance reevaluations that occurred during the triennial reviews and incorporates any more highest attainable condition identified during the reevaluations as the basis for the permit limits of the reissued permit.
Let's stop now and take a couple of clarifying questions. I see that our chat box is full of questions, and as a reminder, we will address a few questions today, but there were some very intricate questions that were submitted to the chat box that we want to take some time to think about, and we will address those on Wednesday's question and answer session webinar. So we'll take 4 questions during this question break. The first one I will direct to Sherry. So Sherry, can you go over the definition of highest attainable condition again?
Yes. Thanks, Janita. So again, we didn't define highest attainable condition in the definition section of our rulemaking. However, 2 things are clear.
highest attainable condition is really the best that can be achieved in the time period. It really is something that's clear on its face. But more importantly, in our regulations, and I'm going to pull them out here, in our new regulations, in 131.14, there is a section that speaks to what is the highest attainable condition. There are 3 options for single discharger variances or multiple discharger variances. We call them discharger parentheses S specific water quality standards variances. And there are 3 options there. And then there are 2 options for water quality standard variances applicable to a water body or a water body segment. So for discharger-specific water quality standard variances, they can express the highest attainable condition as the highest attainable interim criterion, or the interim effluent condition that reflects the greatest pollutant reduction achievable, and again, that's within the time frame of the variance, or 3, if no additional feasible pollutant control technology can be identified, you can express it as the interim criterion or the interim effluent condition that reflects the greatest pollutant reduction achievable with the pollutant control technologies installed at the time the state adopts the water quality standards variance and the adoption and implementation of a pollutant minimization plan. For water body, for variances applicable to a water body or a water body segment, it's a little different. It's either the highest attainable interim use and interim criterion, and you can see there we include the use as well as the criterion. And number 2 is similar to one of the choices under the discharger-specific variances. Again, if no additional feasible pollutant control technology can be identified, the interim use and interim criterion that reflect the greatest pollutant reduction achievable with the pollutant control technologies installed at the time the state adopts the variance, and the adoption and implementation of a pollutant minimization program.
Okay. Thank you, Sherry. We have another question, and I'm going to direct it at Manjali. So early in the presentation, it sounded like a variance could be expressed as a target, such as the number of CSO dischargers per year. But then in the last section, it said the variance must be expressed as an interim use and criterion. So the question is, can the variance be expressed as a specific technology control? Manjali?
So that's a good question. So one thing to note is that when Gary was speaking about the interim use and criterion, he was introducing the sort of legal construct of water quality standards variances, where water quality standards variances are essentially establishing a time-limited use and criterion, which is why under the Act it makes the whole thing okay. However, the way our regulations and our preamble are set up, as well as Gary's explanation, is that an interim criterion or an interim effluent condition, or even the levels currently achievable with the PMP, those are all essentially surrogates for the use and criterion, because essentially what you're saying is, what the state is saying is that what the water quality and the use that results from those controls is the use and the criterion. So it is important to say we are saying that you need to have a quantifiable highest attainable condition, and CSO overflows, those include, those are actually quantifiable expressions of the highest attainable condition. The question about can the variance be expressed as a specific technology control, if the questioner is asking whether we could say our variance requirement is to install X, and that is it, then I don't think that would be acceptable. However, if the variance requirement was we are going to install this technology and obtain this quantifiable level of effluent, then that would satisfy the requirement to have a quantifiable expression. But details like that, again, are things that the various regions and EPA can help support, because a lot of these variances will be very case specific.
Okay. I have another question for Sherry. So Sherry, the question is, does the initial variance need to be done through formal rulemaking, or can it be done through a permit?
Right. A great question. And we do have some language in our preamble that also talks to this. But the bottom line is that a variance, a water quality standards variance, must be reviewed and approved by EPA as a water quality standard under Section 303C of the Act. And what that means is it must be legally binding, and it must come to EPA with an Attorney General certification. It needs to also meet the water quality standards public participation requirements. So with all that said, states can use their permitting process if their permitting process has been adapted to meet those same needs. But the permit cannot be finalized until EPA has approved the water quality standards variance if the permit is to derive from and comply with the water quality standards. So there is an important piece to the timing. You would really want to make sure that you submit a variance into EPA in enough time to get it through EPA and back before you finalize your permit.
Okay. Thank you, Sherry. And the last question that we'll take during this question and answer session break is for Manjali. So Manjali, it sounded like Gary said that states and tribes are required to submit a reevaluation every 5 years, but EPA does not approve or disapprove the reevaluation. Can you elaborate on the purpose of EPA's review of reevaluation?
Sure, this is another really good question. So as a reminder, when Gary was introducing the reevaluations, he introduced it by explaining how when we had proposed our regulations, we had proposed having a mandatory expiration date, shall we say, or a max federal cap on how all variances could not be longer than 10 years. The purpose of the variance is multiple-fold. The purpose of it is to be able to take a look at the same kinds of information that a state or authorized tribe would look at if the variance had actually expired, but allowing that state or authorized tribe to do it without having to go through an entire rulemaking if such a rulemaking is unnecessary. So the purpose of that reevaluation is for the state or authorized tribe to revisit the progress that they've made and to determine whether or not tweaks are needed in that variance, such as tweaks to the high attainable condition if, for example, they undershot what they could do, what the state could do or the discharger could do in the initial variance. The other important piece is to make sure that the public has an opportunity to engage in that evaluation, just like they would have been able to engage if the variance itself had fully expired and the state was looking at a brand new variance. Finally, the purpose of the reevaluation and the submission of the results of that evaluation is to make sure that any permitting authority, regardless of who the permitting authority is fully aware of what the appropriate highest attainable condition is for the permit reissuance.
Okay. Thank you, Manjali. So I'll turn it back to Gary, and we should have additional time at the end of the presentation to take a few more clarifying questions. And then again, if we don't address your question today, we have the question and answer session webinar on October 7th, which is Wednesday. So Gary, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, thanks, Janita. Yeah, now I'm going to talk about permit compliance schedules and how they can be used with water quality standards variances. After receiving public comments on the proposed rule, EPA recognized that there is some confusion about the difference between variances, specifically discharge-specific variances, and compliance schedules. Variances and compliance schedules are two distinct Clean Water Act tools, each with their own purpose. First, there are three main differences between a compliance schedule and a variance. First, a compliance schedule is appropriate where time is needed for a discharger to modify or upgrade treatment facilities to comply with the water quality-based effluent limit in a permit. A compliance schedule requires compliance with the final water quality-based effluent limits of a permit as soon as possible. A variance is appropriate only when achieving a water quality-based effluent limit based on the water quality standard is not feasible, but incremental progress toward that water quality-based effluent limit is feasible. Second, a compliance schedule may only be used in situations where the actions and time needed to comply with the water quality-based effluent limit are known. A compliance schedule is not appropriate based solely on the time needed to develop a total maximum daily load or to conduct a use attainability analysis. A variance may be appropriate when the long-term feasibility of achieving a water quality-based effluent limit based on the water quality standard is uncertain, and more time is needed to determine whether or not it is attainable, and if not, what is the highest attainable designated use. Third, and finally, compliance schedule is granted by the permitting authority and is usually included in the special conditions of a permit. Compliance schedules have their own set of statutory and regulatory requirements among them, Among them, they must contain an enforceable sequence of actions leading to compliance with the final effluent limit derived from the applicable water quality standard. A variance is adopted pursuant to state or tribal law and must be approved by EPA as a new or revised water quality standard before it becomes effective. In situations where complying with the water quality-based effluent limit is not feasible, a variance provides the legal basis for a less stringent water quality-based effluent limit, allowing the permit to derive from and complying with water quality standards. Now I'm going to talk about how a permit compliance schedule and a water quality standards variance together can work to make water quality progress. When complying with a water quality-based effluent limit, it is not when complying with the water quality-based effluent limit is not feasible, the state can adopt a water quality standards variance if it meets the requirements of 131.14. As I mentioned before, the variance acts as an alternative water quality standard that becomes the basis for a new, less stringent water quality-based effluent limit during the variance term. 131.14 specifies that the interim requirements of the variance must reflect the highest attainable condition. The highest attainable condition is the condition of the water or effluent that is the highest attainable by the end of the variance term. Let me emphasize, by the end of the variance term. Although the highest attainable condition is the condition of the water or effluent that is highest attainable by the end of the variance term, it is the applicable water quality standard throughout the variance term. In a situation where the highest attainable condition is the current water or effluent quality, the permittee will likely be able to immediately comply with its new water quality-based effluent limit based on the variance. In a situation where the highest attainable condition is better than the current water quality or effluent quality, the permittee may not be able to immediately comply with its new water quality-based effluent limit based on the variance. In this case, the permitting authority may be able to provide the permittee with a compliance schedule with an enforceable sequence of actions that would result in achieving the new water quality-based effluent limit as soon as possible. This slide uses a hypothetical example to illustrate how a discharger-specific water quality standards variance addressing a 101A2 use can be used together with a permit compliance schedule to make water quality progress when achieving a water quality-based effluent limit based on the underlying designated use is not feasible. In this example, the state updated the criterion for a pollutant that is more stringent than the previous criterion value. The more stringent criterion requires a more stringent water quality-based effluent limit that a discharger cannot feasibly achieve at permit issuance. But the discharger can make progress toward it over 15 years. The state adopts a 15-year variance and uses a compliance schedule to allow the discharger to comply with its permit and make progress toward the more stringent water quality-based effluent limit. The top half of this slide shows a graph with time on the horizontal axis and effluent quality on the vertical axis. The bottom half of this slide shows the timeline of the variance, the compliance schedule, and each permit cycle. The height of the gray rectangles represent each permit cycle and indicate the water quality-based effluent limit of the permit. In this example, the state identifies the highest attainable condition as an effluent condition the discharger can achieve within 15 years. The state adopts and EPA approves a 15-year variance specifying the effluent condition feasible to achieve within 15 years as the highest attainable condition. When issuing the first permit under the variance, the permitting authority establishes a water quality-based effluent limit on the basis of the highest attainable conditions specified in the variance. This is represented as the rectangle labeled Permit 1 that is shorter than the rectangle labeled Permit 0. However, the permittee cannot comply with that more stringent water quality-based effluent limit immediately because it needs time to upgrade its facilities. In this scenario, the permitting authority grants a compliance schedule with an enforceable sequence of actions that will lead to compliance with the water quality-based effluent limit based on the highest attainable condition as soon as possible, in this case, 15 years. The enforceable sequence of actions in the compliance schedule results in progressively better effluent quality as shown as a descending purple line until the effluent quality meets the water quality-based effluent limit specified in the permit 15 years later. Notice that the water quality-based effluent limit of each permit cycle does not change over the course of the 15-year variance. The water quality-based effluent limit for each permit cycle derives from and complies with the water quality standard, in this case, the highest attainable conditions specified in the variance. The compliance schedule allows the permittee to remain in compliance with its permit throughout the 3 permit cycles of the 15-year variance. After 15 years, the variance expires. At this point in time, there are several potential ways forward that depend on the particular circumstances. If achieving the water quality-based effluent limit based on the underlying water quality standard is now feasible, the state could establish the water quality-based effluent limit in the permit and, if needed, provide a compliance schedule. If the state can demonstrate that it is not feasible to achieve the water quality-based effluent limit based on the underlying water quality standard, the state could adopt a subsequent variance with a new highest attainable condition, and if needed, provide a compliance schedule for that. If the state could also consider modifying the designated use if it remains unattainable.
Okay. Let's stop now and take 3 more clarifying questions. So the first one is for Manjali. Manjali, please expand on the 30-day component related to reevaluation. Is that 30 days from permit expiration, or what happens with administratively extended permits, or is that 30 days for the states to evaluate technology, seek public input, and submit them to EPA?
All right, so that's a good question, and I apologize for the confusion. It's important to know that the 30 days portion of the reevaluation is just related to how much time after the reevaluation is complete, how much time does the state or authorized tribe have to submit that to EPA. The 30 days is not a limit on how long the state or authorized tribe has to conduct the actual reevaluation. The details of the actual reevaluation will be established by the state in their schedule. So as an example, although we simplify it to say that the reevaluation must occur, at least every 5 years, a state in establishing the schedule in their regulations may wish to be a little bit more detailed to describe when they plan to initiate that reevaluation and when they plan to complete that reevaluation so that it is done in time to inform whatever it is that they need to inform, depending on how whether they have coincided the reevaluation with either the triennial review or the permit reissuance. But again, the 30 days is only to say that once that reevaluation is complete, they have 30 days to submit the results of that reevaluation to EPA. In relation to how administratively continued permits affect the reevaluation must happen on schedule regardless of whether the permit itself is being administratively continued.
Okay. Thank you, Manjali. I have a question for Sherry. So the question is, to be clear, the permittee has at least 20 years, possibly 28, to continue exceeding certain allowable pollutant limits. I think that's the question. Also, how involved is EPA when the state is reviewing variance extensions for exceeding effluent pollutants? Sherry?
Yes, thank you. So I just want to make sure that folks listening to the webinar do not think that the examples that Gary were presenting is the standard course. So that was a theoretical example, and in that case, the variance was for up to 20 years. However, each variance, the time frame, the term, needs to be justified, and it cannot be longer than that. And in that justification, they're going to need to provide the list of activities that they plan to conduct that will happen during the time period. So what we understand is that the time's going to be justified and that there will be continual progress being made throughout whatever that time period is. As Gary mentioned, those reevaluations for variances greater than 5 years are in place to help ensure to move that forward and make sure that progress is happening. The results of those reevaluations may end up being the basis of a public submitting a petition to EPA, to looking at that variance if progress is not being made, or if there is really a disconnect between what was found in the reevaluations and what is in the highest attainable condition. And ultimately, EPA could use that information to make an administrator's determination. So it's not that that information is not useful to EPA, besides the sort of being the permitting authority in some cases. Importantly, on extensions, so extensions, there isn't really such a thing as an extension. An extension would be a new variance, a subsequent variance. So if you've gotten through the entire period that your variance was approved for, adopted and approved for, if you need a, quote, extension, you don't get an extension. You apply for a new variance. It may be that a lot of the information is similar to the original variance, especially if it was a short-term, very short variance, like a 3-year variance. Not much may have changed, but hopefully there will be enough progress to capture that progress and do a subsequent variance. So again, in a brand new variance, again, it goes adopted through the state and requires EPA review and approval before it can be effective. And permits cannot be written to an extended variance unless that new variance is reviewed and approved by EPA. And again, variances are new and rise water quality standards, and they have a public participation component. So again, the public has a role in any, I'll call it quote unquote, extended variance. In our terms, that's a brand new variance. Okay, did you want to add?
Yeah, I want to add one thing about what Sherry said about the term being justified. So when the term is justified, Sherry meant that have to be justified in the context of what the highest attainable condition is. Mm-hmm. So the justification is what is the highest attainable condition, and documentation of why that may be the highest attainable condition, and the term being how long it would take to achieve that highest attainable condition by the end of the variance term.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question for this break, and it's directed at Manjali. So Manjali, can you further explain when a subsequent variance is necessary in comparison to when a more stringent highest attainable condition is identified and a modified water quality-based effluent limit is derived from the more stringent highest attainable condition?
Thanks, Janita. So this is a great question to follow on what Sherry was just describing. So when we use the term subsequent water quality standards variance, that really is a new variance. And a state or authorized tribe would adopt a subsequent variance when the duration of the variance or the term of the variance has expired or has run up. When we talk about sort of the more stringent highest attainable condition as part of these reevaluations, and that water quality-based effluent limits would reflect those higher, more stringent highest attainable conditions, we're talking about the process of reevaluating the variance during one variance term. So, the terms of figuring out what your more stringent highest attainable condition is actually part of the reevaluation of any variance that's longer than 5 years. Now, it's likely that, let's say, a variance expires, and the authorized tribe realizes they still were not able to achieve the underlying designated use, and they wish to have another one, and they go and they adopt a new variance. It is likely and actually expected that they would have a more stringent highest attainable condition than what was initially adopted in the original variance. But again, that new variance would go through a brand new EPA approval process. One thing to note is that if through a reevaluation a state or authorized tribe realizes that they overcommitted, or in other words, that the high sustainable condition is overly stringent, and they're realizing now that they cannot achieve that, there's no automatic function to make the high sustainable condition become less stringent. In order to make that variance high sustainable condition less stringent, the state or authorized tribe would need to adopt a new variance and go through the full public process and EPA approval to lock in that new high sustainable condition.
Okay. Thank you, Manjali. So we have a couple more slides, and then I think we may have time for maybe one or two more questions, but I'll turn it back to Gary.
Okay, thanks, Janita. If a water quality-based effluent limit for a particular pollutant is not feasible to achieve for multiple permittees for the same reasons, a state or tribe could streamline its water quality standards variance process by adopting a single variance for multiple dischargers or dischargers with specific eligibility requirements instead of adopting variances for each individual permittee. Such a multiple discharger variance must comply with all of the requirements of 131.14 for all the dischargers or discharger groups to be covered under the variance. EPA has a frequently asked questions document on its website addressing multiple discharger variances that was written before the regulation was revised. Although this document predated the final regulation, most of the general principles still apply and are summarized in this slide. As with any variance, a multiple discharger variance must meet all of the requirements of 131.14. That means that a demonstration of unattainability and justification of the variance term must be based on all the dischargers to be covered under the variance. If individual permittees cannot be identified in advance, permittees to be covered under the variance can be grouped on the basis of specific characteristics or technical and economic scenarios that the permittees share. Such a variance would make clear what characteristics a discharger must have or eligibility criteria a discharger must meet in order to be covered under the variance. The more homogeneous a group is in terms of factors affecting attainability of the underlying water quality standard, the more credible the multiple discharger variance will be when submitted to EPA for review and approval. It is EPA's expectation that a state or tribe choosing to identify dischargers in this manner will subsequently make publicly available a list of the facilities the variance covers. A subsequent multiple discharger variance must again evaluate both the conditions that justify the variance as well as the permittees that the variance will apply to. Specifically, permittees that no longer qualify must cease to be covered by the multiple discharger variance. The state or tribe should also include documentation of the feasible progress that was made by each permittee that will be covered by the subsequent variance. Finally, a multiple discharger variance may not be appropriate or practical for all situations and can be highly dependent on the applicable pollutants, parameters, and or permittees. EPA has received questions about whether states and tribes must modify water quality standards variances that were adopted before the effective date of the rule. The short answer is that states and tribes must meet the requirements of this rule on its effective date. As with any water quality standards effective for Clean Water Act purposes, variances must be reviewed on a triennial basis. When a state or tribe reviews a variance that was adopted before 131.14 became effective, EPA strongly encourages the state or tribe to ensure the variance is consistent with the revised rule. EPA encourages the public to engage in triennial reviews and request revisions to variances that states and tribes adopted and EPA approved prior to the effective date of the final rule, so that the public can provide information supporting the need to modify the variance. Some states and tribes may also have adopted binding variance policies and or procedures before the effective date of the revised regulation. I mentioned before that such policies and or procedures are not required by EPA's regulation to utilize variances. However, where states or tribes have variance policies and procedures that are inconsistent with the final regulations, they will have to revise them prior to or simultaneously with adopting a variance that will be reviewed under the new 131.14.
Okay, so that concludes today's presentation, but we have about 5 minutes to take a few more clarifying questions. So I'll speedily get to that. So the first one is for Sherry. Sherry, how does EPA anticipate handling situations where modifications to a state's water quality standards require state legislature's approval?
Okay, great question. Thanks, Janita. So this is a tough one. States with such situations should work as early as possible to engage their EPA region. Those states in that situation may want to establish a streamlined process for the adoption of variances. We talk a little bit about this in our preamble, but again, work with your EPA region, and they'll work with us at headquarters, and we can look at some processes that other states have established to streamline the process.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. Another question, this one's for Manjali. If a state's compliance schedule policy is limited to a 10-year period, what course of action should a state take?
Thanks, Janita. So the course of action that a state or even an authorized tribe in this situation takes kind of depends on what the state wants to do. A state has the discretion to only authorize compliance schedules for particular pollutants for a particular time frame. That's totally up to them. Our regulations don't say anything otherwise. If the state currently has an authorizing provision of only 10 years and the state wishes to change that, all the state would need to do is to adopt a revision to their particular authorizing provision and submit it to EPA for approval.
Okay. I have another question for Sherry. So Sherry, if during the term of a variance a more stringent high sustainable condition is identified and a QBEL is modified based on the more stringent high sustainable condition, how does that QBEL derive from and comply with water quality standards if the QBEL is now based on the highest attainable condition that was not the highest attainable condition at the start of the original variance?
Okay, great. So the piece that we did in our rulemaking to cover just that situation was to require in the state's regulations or in their variance a statement providing that the requirements of the variance are either the highest attainable condition identified at the time of adoption of the variance or the highest attainable condition later identified during any reevaluation consistent with the section in our regs on reevaluations, whichever is more stringent. So Gary spoke to this earlier, and having that provision in the state's regulations or in the particular variance allows it still to comply and allows the permit to derive from and comply with standards, even when the highest attainable condition has become more stringent. So using that provision in the state's regulations or in the state's variance allows that all sort of legally to hang together.
Okay, thank you, Sherry. And we'll take one more question today, and this one I'll direct toward Manjali. So Manjali, can the multiple discharger variance be for discharges on more than one water body, or is the variance only for multiple dischargers on the same water body?
That's another great question. So a multiple discharger variance could be for dischargers on a variety of different water bodies as long as they are experiencing the same challenges such that any justification would equally apply to all of these dischargers.
Okay. Thank you. So everyone, that is all the time we have today. We look forward to addressing your submitted questions on Wednesday's question and answer session. Again, that's Wednesday, October 7th, and it will start at 1 o'clock Eastern. Please submit your questions to WQS Regulatory Clarifications at epa.gov. We will address the questions that are submitted to that email box, and we'll also consider the questions that were not answered today that were entered into the chat box today. So with that, I will end this webinar, but I appreciate you all for attending today. Thank you.